Pain Poultice, an ayahuasca trip report by Dan, posted to earwid.org, January 30th, 2018. I first heard of ayahuasca from a friend who had travelled from Washington to Taos, New Mexico to partake. His tale was intriguing, and I'd previously experimented with mushrooms and acid a few times, back at Grateful Dead shows in the late 1980s and 1990s, so I was aware of how powerful psychedelics can be in changing one's perspective of reality. Steve was married, and prior to his trip to Taos, he typically talked over his wife in what I considered to be an inconsiderate manner. When I visited him at his home upon his return, I was amazed to witness him sit quietly and watch his wife tell stories, all the while beaming his love at her. I told Steve I was very interested in going along the next time the opportunity arose, and a year later it did, and I found myself flying to Taos to meet a Peruvian shaman to take the medicine over 2 nights. Steve told me that there might be a Vietnam veteran there, and that I should avoid sitting next to him. Apparently Steve had sat next to him during a previous ceremony and was overwhelmed with visions of pain and war. When I took the only spot left in the yurt that Friday evening, it was next to the vet. Steve was directly across the room, and 13 other people, including the shaman and his translator, were also present, seated in a circle along the wall of the yurt. After sitting on my blanket on the hard floor for 20 minutes, I realised I should have brought something more comfortable. It would be a very long night for me. My intention going in was to be open to the experience and hopefully to engage with this other dimension I had read about, and perhaps to open up my spiritual self so as to better guide my life. The shaman began the ceremony by blessing the ayahuasca. He opened the liter bottle and blew over the opening several times in between chants. The shaman had rattles and feathers at his side, and during the night he sang his Icaros and shook the rattles rhythmically. It reminded me of scenes of Native Americans and medicine men from old movies and books. The shaman was very gentle in his movements and only looked at us directly when we went up to receive the medicine. I squatted in front of the shaman, who stared into my eyes, sizing me up before pouring the medicine. He was clearly a native Peruvian, small, with leathery brown skin, dark hair, and eyes with an intense gaze. He seemed satisfied with me, and his expression softened as he filled 3/4 of the ceramic cup, about 4 ounces of ayahuasca I would guess. It was thick and pungent, but not wholly unpleasant, and it tasted and smelt of dark vegetation. I downed it and returned to my blanket space. The transition from normal sense to ayahuasca sense was quite slow. I sat quietly with good thoughts and waited with eyes open in the darkened room. There were windows at the top of the circular wall about 8 feet up, but it was quite dark in the desert. After 40 minutes, the first unusual thing I noticed was that there was a presence in the room that seemed to move like a shadow. It seemed to be a man with long legs made of semi-transparent shade that shifted easily, as though breeze blown. I felt his presence as he moved between the people in the darkness. It was disquieting, but did not seem threatening or malevolent, though there was a significant power there. I'd never experienced anything like it before. I got the impression that the spirit was taking the measure of the people in the yurt. I closed my eyes and began to get interesting visuals, mostly in outline form, whitish yellow lines on ink black background. It was somewhat cartoonish. Eyes kept appearing in different places in my field of vision. They seemed to be looking at me, and at one point there was the outline of a man-beast. It was a large man's muscular body with a bull's head, horns and all. It stared at me and did a kind of dance, raising its legs and arms alternately. It seemed like a statement of strength. I was born under Taurus in the zodiac, and I wondered if there was a connection going on. These visions were fairly two-dimensional and tame compared to those I had previously experienced under the influence of LSD and mushrooms, and yet they were completely new. There were some disquieting effects as well. I found myself feeling compelled to project my tongue out like a lizard. I felt like I was becoming a lizard, or perhaps reverting to my lizard origins. It felt creepy and prehistoric. I felt like I was meant to be a lizard in that very moment. This aspect of ayahuasca is apparently not unusual, as Chris later confirmed that he experienced the very same thing. At some point, my inner field of vision became a wall of differently coloured blocks that was being slowly built. The bricks would slowly march along to a monotonous dead-clicking sound, and then place themselves on the wall as it slowly grew higher. It was pretty boring to watch, and the mechanical nature of it sort of bothered me. It seemed to me to be reflecting the artificial nature of reality, that it is merely a construct, perhaps a computer simulation of sorts. The emptiness of it from a spiritual perspective was disturbing to me. I wanted to deny it as a possible reality because it seemed to imply that we are all just machines, or perhaps the products of machines. This sense of the mechanical nature of our underlying reality would repeat itself the following night during my second ceremony. Periodically, I would open my eyes and look around the circular room. Occasionally, light seemed to enter the room from the windows at the top of the wall. I wondered whether it was passing cars, but realised we were fairly isolated. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I could just make out the shaman as he chanted and sang a Zikaros off to my left. By now, there were various sounds from participants emanating from the dark, from moans to brief bouts of laughter or giggling. One guy was having an animated conversation, saying things like, "Nah way," in a very throaty, exaggerated manner, like he just couldn't believe whatever he was experiencing, but he was clearly happy about it. The shadow spirits were still moving about the room, and I could feel them or a breeze they created as they shifted about. They definitely felt very alien, but not necessarily threatening. The shaman's voice would raise up fairly loud in those moments, as though he was trying to control or direct these spirits. We'd been given plastic buckets for the expected purging. I'd read about this aspect of the ceremony, and I kept my bucket close by. I began to hear folks retching in the dark. It sounded unpleasant, but I had no impulse to do it myself. The ayah didn't seem to bring anything up for me. From my research, I had learnt that the shaman believed that people were bringing up poisons from their spirit body that came out as physical matter. The retch could be the bile that contained the emotional illness from past abuse in this life, or even from a trauma in a past life. This was how the medicine worked. The purge provided a physical and spiritual cleansing which healed that aspect of the individual. I didn't purge on either night, but had what one participant with 13 past ceremonies, including weeks in the Peruvian jungle, described as the biggest or second biggest experience she had ever witnessed. That was yet to come though, and it would prove to be one of the most trying events of my life. But before that trial would begin, I began to have a wonderful experience which is quite difficult to remember in detail. It involved more emotion than vision, and it confirmed for me the existence of a higher universal consciousness, which many would call God. My eyes were closed, and the room disappeared as I entered a state of blissful knowing. It was confirmed to me that I was deeply loved and even cherished, and that all was well with me in the world. It's extremely difficult now to remember details, if there even were details. I can only relate that I felt I was in heaven for the next hour, accompanied by a loving and caring Father. This was the confirmation of the reality of our eternal nature, our immortality, the thing I had been seeking all my life. But more than that, it was a confirmation of our essential goodness, of our own essential role in Godhead. We can never be lost, and we are always home, even when we are despairing in life over loss of loved ones or other forms of suffering. I cannot say why we chose to enter this experience of duality out of the oneness which is our home, but I can say that this experience is just that, an experience, not ultimate reality. As is stated at the beginning of A Course in Miracles, nothing real can be threatened, and nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. But suffering is quite possible in this sub-reality, and I was to experience my share of it over the next several hours. So, this is what happened. As I began to come out of my reverie and became once again aware of my surroundings, I heard much suffering. The painful moaning seemed to come from more locations in the darkness, and now there was weeping as well. The shaman had kept up his Icaros, spiritually nursing the participants along their paths. I felt incredibly strong, safe, and secure in my own experience. I felt both my animal nature as a fit, vibrant human male, as well as my spiritual strength. But the effects of the medicine were fading, and right now I was losing my connection to the Godhead. At this moment, the shaman offered, through the translator, to share more medicine with anyone who desired a second dose. I immediately moved over to him and knelt myself in front of him. Once again, he looked at my eyes, holding my gaze as he assessed what I needed. He again seemed satisfied and poured another cup, this time nearly to the top. He blew over it and whispered some words to Mother Ayahuasca, and handed me the cup from both hands, bowing his head slightly as he presented it. I blew over the cup myself before draining it. I nodded to the shaman and returned to my blanket. I attempted to make myself comfortable on the hard floor of the thin blanket. I did not lay down, but sat and focused on my intention. As the audible suffering in the room continued, I realized what I would do, and I made a conscious commitment to Spirit to help those suffering by helping them with their burdens. I thought to Spirit aloud in my head, I can help them with the suffering. I'm strong. It's okay, let me help them with the burden and lighten the load. It was true that I felt very strong both physically and spiritually, but I really had no idea what I was getting into. And so it began. My commitment was honoured. It seemed as though there was a presence in my mind, in the room listening to me. It was a pregnant moment with an air of expectation. Then I sat quietly and waited. This time I kept my eyes open and observed the room as best as I could in the darkness, and tried to remain open to whatever would come. Slowly, I began to feel miserable. Physically, the hard floor felt like concrete to my bones and flesh. The thin blanket provided no relief. I kneeled with my back straight, committed to whatever would come. I began to feel abandoned and alone. I had an internal sense that I would be required to purge, so I began to focus on my gut, and my body occasionally emitted quiet groans as the physical misery, both within and without, intensified. By now I had completely forgotten my commitment to assist others with the suffering, and my sense of spiritual, physical strength was utterly gone. I felt weak and alone, shackled with misery that seemed to grow exponentially as the shaman sang his Icaros. I began an internal dialogue with the shaman. I alternately begged him to shut the fuck up, or at least help me with this horrible crap I was going through. It was like I was 10 months pregnant. With what? I had no idea. But I concentrated on my bucket and willed myself to purge, to no avail. I'd lost interest in what the others were doing. I was at war with the shaman. Each chant of his Icaros seemed to serve to intensify my suffering. He got louder and louder as I stared across the room at his dark form and ordered him to shut it down. I stared with angry eyes, blaming him for my suffering. With each negative thought, his voice seemed to respond with a counter that overrode my will. I was losing this contest badly. We'd been told not to speak to each other during the ceremony. We were to allow each other to experience our path without interruption. Nonetheless, the man to my left, who was seated on a small, tri-legged folding stool, whispered to me, "If you take some water in your mouth, it can help with the purge. Just take a sip and work it around in your mouth." I looked over at his outline in the dark, saying thank you, and picked up my plastic water bottle. I took a sip and held it in my mouth, working it around in an effort to draw the purge up from my gut. I was reconfirming my commitment to do this the right way. My focus through the pain was intense. I accepted the pain, but was determined to overcome it, to do the right thing, to finish this off. I worked the water around for a few minutes and then swallowed it, with some spilling from my mouth onto my shirt. This immediately felt like a fail to me. If I swallowed the water, it would not help me purge, and I desperately wanted to purge as I believed this was the key to ending the blackness of suffering. I took another sip, but this time determined not to swallow it. I would work it in my mouth until the purge came. As I worked the water around in my mouth, over the teeth, into the left cheek, back over the teeth and tongue, into the right cheek, it began to seem to come to life. After 10 minutes, it seemed to solidify into something not water. It also seemed to take on its own energy. It seemed to begin to dart around my mouth like the pointer on a Ouija board. It felt alive somehow, and it felt fetid and horrible. It was a horrible, fetid thing inside my mouth and wanted nothing more than to spit it out into my bucket. Oh, fuck the purge. It had to go. But I had committed, and I refused. I was at war with this thing. I would not eject it until the purge came. And I did feel like puking. Anybody would. But it just would not come. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the shaman stopped singing. Oh, finally, I thought. But he said, "Now we shall have 10 minutes of complete silence." What? I hated him then. I hated him with every fibre of my being. He was determined to torture me. I was sure he could feel my fuck you from across the room as this bolus of fetid putrescence sat in my closed mouth. I whimpered a bit as I settled in to wait. My mouth was quiet, and I breathed through my nose as my aching knees and back cried out. I was physically miserable and mentally despairing, but I refused to give in. After the longest 10 minutes of my life, he began singing again. Then a word formed in my mind. The word was poultice. I didn't think of what the word meant, it simply arrived. It was difficult to believe that this thing in my mouth had begun as water so long ago. I was thinking about how absolutely vile it was and how desperate I was to spit it out, purge or no. And then after that I had a realization. I was not allowed to spit it out. I was to swallow it. The grossness of this realization cannot be overstated. The notion alone should have been enough to make me puke, but I knew that was not going to be allowed. Whatever or whoever was directing this show told me to swallow it, and so I did. I felt that thing every millimetre down my throat, through my esophagus and into my stomach. And when it hit my stomach, I felt it split up into a dozen different rays of what felt like some demon and shoot into my body in all directions. I felt it happen. And at that moment, several people let out horrified moans of disgust in the room in unison. I'd forgotten about them. Apparently there was an audience for my misery. I felt like an abandoned, worthless, disease-ridden dog, sulking in the corner of a dark alley, hiding from the beatings that marked its hopeless existence. This was not success, this was failure. I hadn't purged, and I would not be allowed to. What in God's name was I doing? At this point, someone lit a small candle in the room. I watched the light flicker in the dark. I focused on it, and it even helped. Only a few people had taken a second dose, and people were moving about, apparently leaving. Others were wrapped up to sleep. But I wasn't finished. I knew that. Steve's face appeared next to me. I told him I didn't know what to do. He told me with a smile that I'd already done it. Now that was like a lifeline to me. It gave me some hope. I'm good? Really? I thought. Surely I can stop now. The host shooed him away. Let him do his process, she said. The shaman and his assistant, a pretty young lady in her mid-20s, moved in front of me and asked me how I was doing. I told her I didn't know, that I felt lost in a wilderness of sorts. The shaman lit some tobacco and began blowing it on me, down the back of my shirt, down the front of my shirt, and on the top of my head. He shook his rattle around me as well, chanting the whole time. He then placed his hands on me, and then he departed back to his space, but the girl stayed with me. She sat in front of me, staring into my eyes. She was helping me, a lifeline within the wilderness. We stared into each other's eyes for maybe 10 minutes, and then I felt something coming. It was huge. It was too big, and I was terrified. I leant forward onto my knees, hands on the floor. and I felt it coming from my toes as the muscles in my toes and feet contracted like they were progressively cramping, tighter and tighter. It came from my extremities towards my centre. I felt every single muscle in my body contract consecutively, from feet and hands, calves and forearms, biceps and quads, chest and glutes, all the way into my torso. When the contraction reached my gut and lungs, a howl broke out, rushing out of my lungs until it felt like my lungs were collapsed, completely crushed. For me, it was the howl of all howls, the howl of suffering. It was like a live thing being torn out of my body. The shaman rushed over to me along with our host, concern apparent in eyes and faces. Then it ripped out of me again as my body did another violent contraction. How the hell am I going to survive this, I thought. But then, it was over. I was done. Whatever had just happened, it was finished. The shaman escorted me to the bathroom and told me to put water on my face. He waited by the door as I did. I looked into the mirror, wondering who that lost soul was staring back. I stumbled back out and he took my elbow and walked me back to my blanket. I sat down on it jerkily. Most people who were present were now either asleep or had gone, and Steve and I were to return to our motel room. But our host insisted that I would not leave. He will stay here tonight. And then, that was that. They wrapped me in several more blankets against the November desert night, and I just laid there, eyes open towards the circular ceiling, wondering what had happened, but grateful it was over. The next morning I took a walk with the translator up the long dirt driveway in the cold morning air. The sun was shining, and while I was relieved that it was over, I wondered what I had done that night. What had actually been accomplished? What was the point? I asked for her interpretation, and she said she felt that I was working with my own family, maybe even ancestors. This confused me, as I'd believed I was committing to helping those present at the ceremony of the suffering. How did my own family get involved? We returned from the walk and re-entered the building, and there I met a participant from the previous night, a woman who asked me, "Are you Dan? Are you the one who had the experience last night?" She said she had information for me, and I eagerly asked what it was. I was still desperate to give the suffering meaning. This is what she said. She told me that in her life she was a medical doctor, a physician. She had a practice in Arizona. She'd been to the Peruvian Amazon for ayahuasca ceremonies. She'd participated in over a dozen of them. She told me that while sometimes she had revelatory experiences, she was just drifting last night until my experience began, at which point she had said she committed to helping me through it. She poured her focus onto my experience. She said it was like helping me give birth, and I was rather struck by that reference. While I cannot know what the experience of giving human birth is like, it certainly seemed to me that the contractions were forcing something out of me. That something was so huge, I recall being certain that my throat could not accommodate it on the way out. Also, the physical pain of the process was utterly amazing, so that analogy she gave carried serious weight. The good doctor told me that from across the room, in the darkness, it was like she was watching a movie over my head. She witnessed moving scenes of people in bondage, walking in misery, single file in manacles or shackles. She said that she believed those people were my people, my clan, and she witnessed me labouring to take that suffering from them, alleviating their pain. She said that she witnessed me converting the darkness of their suffering into light. She said I was like a portal through which their suffering was transmuted. She said she believed they would never know what I had done for them, but it was the one of the two biggest things she had ever experienced or witnessed at an ayahuasca ceremony. From darkness to creating light in the universe. My fear had been that the suffering was all pointless. For one, I had no sense of accomplishment from the experience, just relief that it was over. Then the word came back to me. Poultice. A soft, moist mass of material applied to the body to relieve soreness and inflammation. Maybe she was right. I'd made a deep commitment to help with their suffering. I just didn't know the suffering would be that of my own family. While I went back for the second night, committed to see the 2-ceremony process to completion, several people were surprised I had returned, as was I. After we received the medicine, I sat quietly. I had a sense that this was the black magic referred to in ancient times. The shaman this night seemed to me a technician. He could have worn a lab coat. It seemed less spiritual and more mechanistic. I can't truly say I have any idea why. But when the 2 Native Americans who were present the second night began to struggle, I was moved to offer to help with that suffering. Luckily, before I made that commitment, I thought better. It was a mother and a daughter, and the mother began moaning. "What are you doing to us? Why are you doing this to us?" There was fear in her voice, and I thought of the massive suffering of the Native Americans, shuddering to think of the work that might entail. Eventually, the 2 were led outside and did not return. Once as poultice was enough for me. The Gift of Gratitude, an ayahuasca trip report by My Cup Runneth Over, posted to earwid.org, April 4th, 2020. In the final months of 2019, I went through the double whammy of breaking up with my fiancée and having my father pass away very suddenly within a month of each other. I started seeing a therapist to talk over my anxiety, depression, anger and grief. This was helping, and I felt that my inner life was taking an upturn, so I wanted to make sure I didn't lose that progress. I'd heard about DMT and ayahuasca when I was in college, and I was always curious but could never find it to try it out. In 2016, I signed up for an ayahuasca experience when I was in Peru, but I ended up bailing on it due to the setting feeling pretty sketchy at the time. So my journey to find ayahuasca lasted over a decade, until this year when I had the time, money, and mental state required to tackle it. I did some research about retreats in South America where I could do it without any kind of legal concerns. I settled on a 7-day retreat in Peru where I would experience 3 ayahuasca ceremonies, as well as a Bufo Alvarius ceremony, a Tobacco Rapé ceremony, and a San Pedro ceremony. This is the story of the first ceremony. I signed up about 4 weeks before the retreat was scheduled to start. I had my medical intake call with the doctor 3 weeks ahead of travel, and I stuck to the diet relatively strictly. A brief summary. No red meat, no caffeine, which I spent a week tapering off. No alcohol, low salt, low sugar, no dairy. This started 1 week before. Very little food with tyramines, which I'd never actually heard of before now. Is a monoamine compound that can interfere with the medicine apparently. And finally, no prescription medication at all. I took a painkiller once in the week before the retreat. I spent the day of the ceremony in various parts of the Sacred Valley, Calcha, Pisac, Urubamba, hearing about the dialogue of opposites and how the Incas and the Peruvians think about the land. I had my last meal at around 2:30 PM, which was a small portion of chips and guacamole, and some lemon, ginger and honey tea. My last drink of water was at 5 PM, and I arrived at the temple at 7:15 to prepare myself for a 7:30 start. 10 other guests of the retreat were joining me for the experience. 6 Americans, 3 Aussies and 1 Kiwi. The gender makeup of the group was 7 men and 4 women. There were 2 shamans and 2 facilitators present. One by one, the guests were brought before the facilitators and offered their dose. We were told to have an intention ready to offer to the medicine, silently. Mine was to feel unafraid, of people, of asking for help, of showing who I really am to others, of connection, and of losing control. I took half a cup of the medicine. I cannot say what the size of the cup was, but it looked like an extra wide double shot glass. I was later offered a second dose, which I turned down. The syrupy liquid, which had a consistency like a watered-down honey, tasted very woody and bitter, but the taste only lingered for a short time. I rinsed my mouth out after about 5 minutes once I was sure that I swallowed all of the remnants. Within about 15 minutes of downing the medicine, I began to feel feverish. It started in my forehead and spread over the side of my face before travelling down my body. It was a little bit chilly in the temple, so this was my sign that things were about to kick off. With my back upright on the mattress and my eyes open, the world started to open up in front of me, with repeating patterns of purple and green overlaid on the near pitch dark room around me. I thought that if things were this strong with my eyes open, I should definitely close them. The visuals became a lot more vivid with my eyes closed. They morphed into a white, black and blue steel pattern that formed a bird-like figure in front of me, with an endless wing in a spiral shape curving downward. The light was interesting to me because during my normal meditation, I often have trouble imagining the purifying beam of light that some people use to focus their breath. I was drawn into the figure and transported to a view of a line or semicircle of entities. They didn't really show their form to me. I was brought before one of them and felt or perceived the words, "This is a gift." The songs kicked in hard and the shaman's voices and notes influenced the visuals heavily. I have audio-visual synesthesia already, but this was so beyond anything that I had ever experienced before. After 10 or 15 minutes, I had my first purge. My mind kept being brought back to my body with a minor gagging sensation, but I gladly let it happen. It was foamy, maybe due to the guac from lunch, but I'm not really sure. I had 3 or 4 more purges after this, at times of great beauty in the Icaros sung by the shamans. I spent probably an hour just staring open-mouthed in awe at the ceiling, which wasn't really there, being shown all my memories and relationships in life. These became tangible objects for me to examine and manipulate objectively. So many memories that had strong emotions associated with them didn't make me feel the sting at that moment. I was getting a steady stream of instructions and insight from the medicine, of which I could only remember about 20% afterwards. The other guests right now were also purging pretty heavily. I began to think of all the people who have influenced me and moulded me. I felt such joy and gratitude that I just couldn't stop crying. I thought of my family, my college friends, my co-workers, and felt an overwhelming desire to tell them how happy they've made me. I wanted to share the experience with everybody right now. It was the happiest I've ever felt in my life by a long shot. I came back to my body once with the sudden fear that I was about to pee my pants, but the feeling passed. I had memories appear that I hadn't thought of in years, or in some cases, decades. I was hearing words and names in the Icaros that triggered the memories very suddenly and without warning. There was no real logic to my lines of thought, meaning that there was seemingly no connection between one memory and a subsequent memory. It was stressed to us before the ceremony that you must surrender to the medicine, because you have no hope of winning against it, and you'll only hurt yourself and break your process if you will. With that in mind, I just kept letting the medicine show me what it needed to show me. The times when I actually started to resist seemed to coincide with the times when the shamans would have during their Icaros, and it seemed to be bad for them, so I did my best to just go with the experience. I felt immense gratitude the entire time, for the same people as listed above, but also for the shamans and facilitators, who spend so much of their time and energy trying to heal groups of poor souls like me. Gratitude was definitely the theme of the night. That's a great theme to have during such a challenging experience. I rode the positive waves down until I was sober. The shamans and facilitators took turns singing songs and playing instruments, which was so incredibly beautiful. In the darkness, one of the facilitators lights a Mapacho cigarette and offered its smoke to everyone's heads and hands in turn. We were brought 2 by 2 in front of the shamans to receive our personal Icaros. My legs were really wobbly, and I needed help getting to my feet. By this time, I was mostly out of the woods and only really felt tingling in my arms and face. I finished up and went back to my mattress, spending the rest of the time there just enjoying the music. I began to feel a little gastric distress. My guts were bubbling towards the end of the night. We closed out the ceremony and I spent another half hour eating fruit, drinking some herbal tea, and chatting with the other guests. Then I went back to my room to try to sleep, but my mind was still racing and I was up for another 2 hours. The entire ceremony lasted from 7:30 PM to 1:15 AM. There was very little perception of time though. All I could tell was that it was a long time. But there were some periods of drastic time skips. This was absolutely one of the most profoundly emotional experiences I have ever had. I've never cried so much in my entire life, but it was in a good way. They told us that no matter what, you will purge what needs to be purged in whatever form is most appropriate. The constant flow of tears felt good because I wasn't an overly emotional person for most of my life. So maybe the energy blockage that was removed from me was in my tear ducts. The first experience was completely positive for me. I thought about my family and how we would adjust to my father's death, and what I could do to make their lives easier, and how I could help them deal with the loss. Since my intention was to feel unafraid of connection, maybe the medicine was trying to show me how much I had to feel grateful for. And if so many people had helped me create such treasured memories, then maybe I shouldn't fear more people entering my life. Well, it was truly awe-inspiring, and among the most significant experiences I have ever been through, outdone only by the Bufo ceremony of 5-MeO-DMT later in the week, which is another story entirely. Love, Terror and Revelation, an ayahuasca trip report by Kontanji, posted to Irwid.org, March 4th, 2017. Set. I had done what I told myself was ayahuasca twice before, using Syrian rue and Mimosa hostilis. This would be the first time using the traditional recipe of Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis. A note on the timing of this journey. 4 days earlier, I'd lost my brother-in-law, who'd been suffering from liver disease for almost a year while awaiting a transplant, and I was with him when he passed. This was weighing heavily on me going into the journey. On the one hand, I could be setting myself up for a hellish experience, but on the other hand, it could prove to be the perfect timing to release the trauma of that event. As usual, it proved to be a mashup of both of these situations. Preparation. 100 grams of Banisteriopsis caapi, yellow vine, was shredded and combined with 100 grams of fresh Psychotria viridis and 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. Just enough distilled water was added to cover the plant material and cooked over low flame just below boiling for 3 hours. Then the mixture was poured off through a t-shirt into a second steel pot, and fresh water and vinegar was again added to the plant material for a second wash for another 3 hours. The process was then repeated a third time, leaving me in the end with about 800 milliliters of ayahuasca, which was then reduced down over the course of 2 hours to 650 milliliters. This was then to be split into 2 separate doses at 325 milliliters each. The entire process from start to finish took about 15 hours. Throughout the entirety of the brewing and reducing process, I smudged the kitchen and medicine with white sage, and repeatedly whispered my intentions to the plant spirit. To let go of my fear, my pain, my anxiety, and my anger. Setting. I prepared my room by lighting candles, propping up pillows on the bed and having a lined garbage can handy for the purge. I also packed myself a bowl of cannabis and kept a candle burning in the nearby bathroom. Before drinking, I performed a Kundalini yoga set for the coordination of mind, body and soul. I then again smudged the room with white sage, all the while chanting the Shabad mantra for protection. Ad Gure Name. Administration. I sat cross-legged on the bed and whispered my intention one last time into the glass of ayahuasca. In retrospect, 325 milliliters was a lot, and I probably should have reduced it further. It took me about 20 minutes to finish drinking it down in small gulps. The taste was intensely bitter, in a rank coffee kind of way. But upon finishing the glass, I set it down and began meditating on my breath. I could feel the liquid sloshing anxiously around in my gut, but I continued to focus on the breath, knowing I needed to keep it down for at least 20 minutes if I wanted the full effect. A playlist of soft music filled the room. At the onset, I can't delineate when my situation transitioned from waiting to arrival. Suddenly, thoughts were disjointed. I was waiting for something. What was happening next or before? What song was playing? Who was asking? My vision was suddenly blurry, and when I turned my head, it took some time for my eyes to catch up with the rest of my head. Confusion set in, followed by nausea. The purge. I never made the decision to vomit. I was just vomiting. I pulled the garbage pail between my legs and let it go, a deep, ragged retching that despite its intensity only managed to bring up what seemed like a small amount of liquid. Suddenly, my bowels clenched, and I watched myself fly from the bed to the bathroom, garbage pail still in hand. Now I was projectile releasing from both ends simultaneously. My head filled with the noise of my own retching and shitting. This terrible sound was suddenly familiar. I'd heard this just 4 days earlier, made by my brother-in-law as he lay dying. An unspeakable realization dawned on me. I was not only myself here and now in the bathroom being sick, I was simultaneously my brother-in-law dying in the hospital. What had always seemed to be two events separated in time and space and within two different people, now revealed itself to be one singular event happening to the same consciousness. There's no way to convey this kind of dread, this fear. I continued purging from both ends, and in between each heave would ask out loud if I was really my brother-in-law, and if this was really even happening. And then I was shown flashbacks of every terrible thing I'd ever done, everyone I'd ever wronged, every lie I'd ever told since I was a child. All this guilt just being churned up for me to witness before being puked out. And when it was done with me, I purged for humanity's atrocities. Murders, rapes, injustice, you name it. It was all given to me to be vomited out and released. I honestly believed it would never end. A voice. Now, I'm calling it a voice, but no, it was not a voice, but what I can only describe as a telepathic signal and kind of messaging, impossible to adequately articulate, although it was certainly female, began to calmly suggest that I should gather myself and get back on the bed. And somehow I did. Lift off. I crawled back to the bed and for a moment considered smoking some cannabis to take the edge off. The voice returned, and her message was more or less, "No. You asked for me, and you got me. I'm not sharing you with anyone else." The voice struck me as that of a jealous lover. I laid down and closed my eyes. 1,000,000 lifetimes and the talents of every great artist who ever lived would not be enough to even approximate the utterly impossible beauty that surrounded and enveloped me in that moment. Blues, pinks, greens, yellows, snaking vines and embracing tentacles of galactic vegetation. Pulsing mounds of shimmering alien flesh, dripping with thick, wet jungle sex and death and birth, and every stage of life and being in between. A vaginal opening in the center of my vision, pouring forth a light that was the source of all creation, and from it poured a rainbow of primordial language and symbols, the very foundation of universal mathematics, the archetypes of cosmic structuring. My soul shook with orgasm as I was pulled apart and painted upon the entirety of existence in the same pattern that I beheld. All these silly words I have to use, what's the point? It's simply indescribable in the end. I've smoked DMT before. A child's kaleidoscope compared to this. And behind this incredible experience was the hum, the ever-present buzz behind all levels of dimensionality. And also her, the vine, with me, massaging towards and through me with her tendrils, working her love deep into my astral bodies. Panic. I can't recall when or why it took a hard turn, but it did. Suddenly, I was pulled out of this cosmic botanical paradise, and instead flipped into a world not unlike the repetitive flipbook-like quality of a Salvia experience. I kept seeing myself and others caught in a repeating trap of trying to accomplish something, trying to achieve some kind of resolution that can never be achieved. The burden, the incredible weight we carry around in this dimension. Nothing can ever be finished, there is no end. We slouch groaning towards some make-believe ever after that is only a lie invented by a mind that has lost its mind. We are trapped. Nothing stops, nothing concludes. We cannot let go. We just carry the weight from one repeating moment to the next. Just as I could not adequately describe the beauty of the previous stage, similarly, I cannot convey anywhere near the sheer terror that now filled my being. I felt as though the entirety of my existence was the front end of giant roaring waves that would never crash to the shore, but would just forever fall and roar, and ache with the desire of a relief that will never arrive. In that moment I begged for death out loud, for at least that would be an ending of sorts. Then the vision pulled back, and I saw that I was only myself at this particular moment, but in reality, I was all selves that ever or would ever exist. The notion of selves in and of itself is the trickiest of illusions. Each individual life is a split-second costume thrown upon universal consciousness by this strange phenomenon called mind. Only down here does it feel solid, real, and linear. I was pulled out of the illusion into a violent wake of realization, pulled up furthermore, then into a still, silent space outside of all known phenomenon, the ever-present stillness. This was not relief, for this was not anything, and yet it was simultaneously all things. There was no me to experience this, however. I was like the doll made of salt who is dropped into the ocean. The return. When I returned to my body, it shook as though having a seizure. Incredible electric vibration coursed through my limbs and out of my hands and feet. My head was turned, and my eyes laid upon a photograph illuminated by a candle. It was 3 of my closest friends, toasting a cup of wine in the gorges of Ithaca, New York. Their arms snaked like the vine itself, and love and friendship poured from their eyes and fell into my own. This was the first sign of return, that was coming back, to which I wept with relief. I wept with joy for my children, my wife, and for my brother-in-law. Over the course of the next hour, I slowly pulled myself back together, and from the centre of my chest began the expansion of a now incomprehensible serenity, an understanding that when it falls away, only love remains. It is in a sense the only thing that is truly real. Outside it was raining. I crawled off the bed, stripped off my clothes, and walked out into my back porch. The cool rain showering down on my naked body washed away the slick sweat of the struggle, mixed with my tears, and filled me with gratitude. In retrospect, this is simply the most powerful medicine I've ever taken. 3 days later, I can still feel the vine in me, snaking through my consciousness, delivering insights, questions, and ideas. It is asking me for a real commitment to ongoing work with her. I feel no real choice but to oblige, although I believe the course now to explore smaller doses and perhaps even with some vine-only brews. This experience was less a first step and more a complete purge. I know I can integrate this, but I don't believe another balls-to-the-wall soul-fucking is what I should be seeking the next time. I've been shown her powers, but to truly learn and grow with this teacher, I believe I need to start from the beginning, with small, slow steps. Communion with Spirits, an ayahuasca trip report by Hemlock, posted at earwid.org, November 21st, 2011. I've participated in about 25 ayahuasca ceremonies over the years, and I found it to be the most profound and productive plant which I've encountered. I only use it in a ceremonial setting, as that augments the experience tremendously. The following is a description of one of my journeys from a couple of years ago. We meet in a large room which can be darkened almost to pitch black. This adds to the internalization of the journey, and helps to make the experience as individual as possible. After I set up my chair, percussion things, water, tissue and bucket, I spend time outside greeting friends and getting to know the first-timers. I always enjoy it when we have a good number of first-timers present. After we're called in, the shaman explains the ceremony and effects of the plant, and some of the newbies ask questions. Then, we're ready to go. We get smudged and sit quietly while the shaman sings and prays, awakening the spirit of the plant. One by one we approach and drink. I've become much more sensitive to the plant over the years, and usually only drink a small amount. But in that moment I wanted to do some hard work, and drank an entire cup of maybe 1 to 1.5 fluid ounce. The taste of the brew is difficult for me, and I have to work a bit to keep it down immediately. After everyone is drunk, we sat in darkness and quiet until the shaman offers another prayer, beginning his songs or Icaros. About 45 minutes into the ceremony, I begin to get the familiar geometric visuals and buzzing in my head, which signal the onset. Very quickly I begin to experience the presence of spirits. The first spirits I see are shamans dressed as large birds. They are dressed in white robes with decorations, and are standing in a line which extends as far as I can see, one behind the other. The message I get from this is that the ceremony is the result of ages and ages of people using this brew to gain esoteric knowledge, and that this knowledge is real. After all, people have been studying ayahuasca for far longer than they've been studying science. Fairly quickly, the line of shamans fades, and I see the shaman building the foundation for our journey. He builds a space of sorts for us to be safe, and begins to ask for assistance from various plant and animal spirits. Ayahuasca, flowers, trees, jungle cats, hummingbirds, etc. are all invoked. As this progresses, I experience myself in a large cave with people dancing in a ritual manner. Very powerful. The shaman continues with his songs, invoking and evoking different experiences. After about 1.5 hours, I purge, and then relax a bit into the rest of the journey. So far, so good. At one point during this journey, I began to meet strange entities. Some of these entities may give gifts, some seem to be just there for the visit, and some of them do work on me. One entity was a large being with a metallic face which had several different planes. His body was covered with a sort of cloak, and after he stood and looked into me for a while. He opened the cloak, and another face with a long probing nose began to work on my heart chakra. Another being, similar to a large mosquito-type insect, came and sat on my chest, which removed the top of my head and worked on my brain. One of the things which makes the ayahuasca journey so different from other psychedelic experiences is the degree to which it is shared. After this particular journey, a man across the room asked me if I was visited by a large insect-like being which worked on me. Keep in mind that our ceremony is conducted in almost complete darkness. My daughter, who was also at this ceremony, was also visited by the man with the metallic face. After the visits from the beings, I began to slowly come down. The shaman asked several of us to play our instruments or sing if we feel called by the spirit of the plant to do so. I am able to join in the drumming and later to play the guitar as well. While playing the guitar, I was able to experience how my playing affected others in their journey, and to be able to help them with the work. This is the first time that I've had a taste of what the shaman must be experiencing most of the time. Several people purge while I play, which brings a great sense of accomplishment to me. After about 5 hours, I am down enough to stand and walk over to eat a light meal. This is always one of the more wonderful things about our ceremonies. The taste of the foods is indescribable, and the incredible lightness which everyone has is very conducive to great fellowship. Another 2 hours or so of eating and talking with fellow travellers, and I'm on my way home. For me, ayahuasca is not recreational in the sense of being fun and relaxing. It is hard work and very demanding, but the exploration, insights and cleansing make it very worth the effort. It's certainly not a journey for everyone, but I am profoundly thankful that the plant called to me.